Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم في لقائنا هذا. And this will be our second and final session for the first halaqah, the Sunday Circle halaqah on depression. And last session we spoke about many things about depression, the stigma around depression, the history of depression, how it impacts communities, what are the symptoms of the depression, and we also spoke about the Maqasid of the Shariah. The Maqasid of the Shariah, the overarching, the general goals of our faith tradition, right? What do we seek to achieve? So just for a quick recap, we have, well, first of all, we have a special guest speaker, this sister to my left, Saudia Rahim. She's a mental health professional and counselor. She has a bachelor's degree from the CUNY School of Professional Studies and a master's degree in counseling from Alfred University. And we're very blessed to have you here. Jazakumullahu khairah for helping me do this. So our recap, we focused on the Maqasid of the Shariah, the overarching goals of the Shariah. What are the goals of our lives? And what is the goal of this legislation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon us? And we know that it has 5 distinct principles. Al-Hifdh, protection of the religion, Hifdh ad-Din, protection of the lineage, the family relationship, the marriages, the parent and children aspect, the children to children aspect, being close with your neighbors, being close with your siblings. So Hifdh al-Nasl. And then you have Hifdh al-Mal, our property, our wealth, our money. And we have the protection of our aql, Hifdh al-Aql, which is the protection of our intellect, our brains. And we also have the protection of our nafs, our lives. Our lives are so important. Allah Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said that the blood of a Muslim is more sacred than that of the Kaaba. So this is, in short, the Maqasid of the Sharia. And the point of doing these halaqas is to promote and implement these goals and achieving these goals in our lives. Now, why haven't we done this before? We said last session, the last halaqah, that religious clergymen and community leaders have often avoided speaking about this, especially in masajid, especially in Guyanese masajids, West Indian masajids. And we find that they have a stigma around this type of thing. So it's due to lack of understanding, prioritization of spiritual frameworks. So Sister Saudia, just curious, why haven't we done this before from your perspective?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me. But before we begin, I do like to clarify that my purpose for today is an educational information based on mental health, and it's not a substitute for any personal therapy or professional guidance. Anything that I'm answering is of general questions and general answers. But if today's discussion raises any personal questions and concern, I encourage you to reach out to a mental health professional. I could be here as a resource and to guide you to finding the help that you need, and to remember that seeking help is a sign of strength. And to answer your question that why is this important and why is it something that not kind of been touched on in our communities, it's based on very several factors of how taboo certain things are, or afraid that's a weakness in our faith or in our character. There are certain struggles that we face alone as in a community. A lot of the times we are told that when we are struggling, we seek for Allah's help and we return to Allah. And that is essentially true. But then now to open up about the vulnerabilities, because sometimes when we think about our vulnerabilities, we see it as a sign of weakness. But sometimes our vulnerabilities is what makes us strong. And sometimes we forget that. And when we sit and we make our salah and we ask Allah for help, Allah is not going to come down straight and help you from His face. He sends His creation. He sends people. He sends the community. And our community is what our Islam teaches us, the sense of support and building factors in that. And sometimes mental health struggles can be seen as possession, or somebody have been seen being black magic or evil eye, right? And so you may send to seek help in those sense of help, where instead of seeing a professional to see the root causes of why you're feeling this way. Especially for our younger generations who kind of came from balancing your cultural identity, figuring out your American identity, figuring out your cultural identity, our Guyanese identity, as well as our Muslim identity, in creating that internal conflict. Sometimes we may feel we don't know how to challenge those. And in all honesty, when it comes to our religious practices, like praying our 5 daily prayers and doing the things that we're obligated to do, sometimes that even isn't a test. Like ensuring that we pray that 5 salah on time can also lead to anxiety and guilt, right? And if someone is struggling with these issues, sometimes people are struggling with anxiety and depression that may inhibit them from performing these acts of religious rituals. And now having that sense of guilt can cause you to avoid or not go into that. Again, but that can lead to judgment from the community, like, oh, well, that's why you're not, you're experiencing anxiety and depression.
You have depression, you have anxiety, therefore there must be something wrong with your iman.
Right, or, well, you missed your fajr, or you missed your maghrib.
And you're the worst person in the world.
Pretty much, yes, and then you're just like, wait a minute, no, I have other issues going on that's preventing me from doing this, but we're not looking at the real problem, just like a blanket over what is the root cause of it.
I like that you touched on the word, forgive me for a second, you touched on the word vulnerable.
Yes.
Why do you think that is? Why were the past generations, or the generations that were immigrants who came to this country, why was it so important to seem not vulnerable?
Well, we also have to remember that everything we do is with compassion and empathy, right? So it's going back and understanding that the generation that came from us, that they came from a culture and time that these things were not likely talked about, right? So it's coming back from understanding, like we can say that, yes, we have knowledge, but then don't go and bash the older generations, right? Saying that, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do that for me because of what it is, but you also have to remember that the time and culture was different. It was a time where, you know, certain things may not have been talked about because people didn't know how. Right? Maybe they didn't know how to navigate it, how to sit with those hard feelings. And sometimes those hard feelings are so uncomfortable that it does cause conflicts in families. It does cause conflicts within friends and the community. But our emotions get such involved in it where we don't see beyond the bigger picture. We just see what we're feeling in that point. So, you know, in therapy, in mental health therapy, it's not just sitting there talking about your feelings. One of the biggest things is that you take a look at how you feel and what are you putting out, right? How are you reacting for someone to react that way for yourself? And then thinking about how to, you know, be different in that sense. And again, you know, having that empathy, we talked about like our parents, our older generation was immigrants. Yeah. Coming from an understanding that in their mindset, it was survival, right? Coming from here, they needs to make sure there was food on the table. They need to make sure that there was money coming in, that, you know, at this point in time, sometimes their heads are not in that mindset of like, well, I need to sit there and process the emotions because one, they weren't taught to. Second of all, like that time and generation was about survival at that point.
So it was about survival.
It could be.
They came as immigrants. It's about survival. They wanted us to have a better life. but at the
Yeah.
same time they did not understand.
It was just not understanding, or maybe, just didn't know how to at that point, right? So as we grow both, right, us as younger generation and the older generation, it's a continuously growth, right?
Understood.
And having your mind to be open to be having these hard conversations is, it goes both ways.
Understood. Understood,
Yeah.
Jamil. Jazakumullah khairah for that insight. Just to continue with the recap, we spoke last time as well about Islamic mental health. And Islamic mental health, it entails several basic things. Two of those basic things are of utmost importance: the concept of the fitrah, right? The innate natural disposition, the natural inclination of a man, of a woman, of a human being. And that every individual is created with this fitrah, this natural inclination. And then the second is the nature of the self, right? And I gave many lectures and khutbas about the self, in which we have a nafs al-mutma'inna, the best self. And then we have the self that blames you, a nafs al-lawama. And then we have the worst type of self who doesn't care about anything, a nafs al-amara bis-su'a. So we did a quick recap of that. So also we have spiritual remedies, right? We spoke about spiritual remedies. And the thing about being, assistant imam, what happens is I can't help someone with depression. I could tell them to go read more Quran. I could tell them to go make more dhikr, more dua. Tell them, hey, straighten up your life, or don't go do this, don't go do that. And that's all I can really do. So you have the spiritual remedies, and I'm sure religious remedies do help. Of course, our religion is perfect, our tradition is perfect. They do help, but it's not the only cure, right? That's where you come in with your expertise. We have to seek professional help, right? Where Islam promotes this, seeking help from people who can help you. So before I get into how we can cope with depression through the Quran, through the Islamic lens, just wanted to ask you one thing. So how important is this whole thing? How
Well-
important is it really? Because I liked what you said about, some people saying it might be evil eye or jinns. And I gave the story last time about a group of guys in Guyana who, they really beat the hell out of this guy. Like beat him, and he put him in the ER. They thought there was a jinn in him. There wasn't any jinn in him. He was just going crazy or something. So how important is this whole thing? We have suicides. We have 1 out of 15 people is depressed. We have Guyana. In South America, Guyana is the #1 country with the most suicide rates. How important is this?
This is quite important. So I'll give a stats. I'll give a short story. It's very short, and then I want to go into the why is this important by age. And there is an academic journal based on Muslim statistics, and in it it's called JAMA Psychiatry, and it examined lifetime suicide attempts among different religious groups in the United States, and these are the findings. For Muslims, it's 7.9%. For Protestants, it's 5.1%. For Catholics, it's 6.1%. For Jews, it's 3.6%. We have one of the highest rates of suicide attempts, right? Not suicide, like they committed suicide, but in actual thinking about suicide and thinking about actual, taking their life. One of the highest rates in there. And now we think of, why is that, right? Some of those things that I've talked about before. A little about the short story that I like to say is one of my students that I used to teach. She is kind of one of my inspiration to go into mental health, was that, she would come and she would draw these little cats on my board, right? And as the days goes by, I realized that the cats mimicked the way she felt, right? So it was like a little telling of the way she felt throughout the day. There was one day she came in and she drew this cat and it was red all over. So my instincts are like, all right, there's something not okay with her. She came and she told me, hey, miss, can I speak to you? The kids would come into my room all the time, so I had to push them out. And as soon as I went back to her, and mind you, this is a stellar student, A student, amazing student. She is robotically drawing on the board, like this, because she's nervous. How do I bring this up? And then I asked her, like, honey, I'm here, what's wrong? At least open up, what's going on? She didn't have to say anything. She pulled down her sleeves. She was cutting herself, right? All over her arms. These are things that our Muslims are dealing with, right? And we see this a lot in schools where kids are harming themselves. And you sit there and you question what is going on. So what I like to bring into this age group is that, from this age group, from 7 to 18, the things that, people at this age deal with is we see a rise in ADHD, we see a rise in kids with autism, we see bullying and peer pressure from kids. And in a general study, boys at 10 years old have suicide thoughts, right? Because of peer pressure and bullying. Self-esteem, who are they? How do I identify what I'm feeling? One of the talks that I went to was that, we give girls the opportunity to have the emotional experience, but we denied the boys of having an emotional experience, right? And the only two emotions that they're allowed to feel is anger and happiness. Everything else gets lost. Then we tell those same boys to go up and be the leaders of their homes. They be the leaders to take care of their daughters, their wives, and they don't know how to manage their emotions. We, for the older kids from like 18, we have body image issues, we have self-esteem issues, substance abuse and addictions. This is the age where people are experimenting with, substances. Identity and sexual issues, right? This is the time where kids are experiencing these things. Academic and performance anxiety. Like performance and perfectionism in a lot of these kids at this age is something that leads to that self-harm, that I need to be this perfect person. If I don't get this 90 on this test, that means I fail. Half the time it's like switching their mindset on this, and that caused them to feel as if they're not good enough, right? And then one of the biggest things is social media influences on mental health. The young adult and adulthood, that's from like 19 to 49. So I'm like, just kind of like pushing everything in at this point. But we do have life transition at this point, marriages. This is the time where people are expected to, hey, it's time for you to get married. And we're getting all that expectation to push to get married, but what does a relationship look like, right? You pushed into a marriage to fulfill something, but you don't know how to have, fulfilling relationships, like communication. How do you deal with your anger? How do you deal with finances? These are all parts of what it means to be in a marriage. Stress and burnout, like thinking about careers at this point. Again, this is where substance abuse now comes to substance use disorders, because now you have been dependent on substances to help cope. Now it becomes like a dependency. Loneliness and social isolation. Social anxiety is on the rise. Like a lot of people having, our fear of like communicating in public. Again, also body image and binge eating are something that I've seen across. Then in this bigger stuff too, it's like divorce, marital issues, the grief and loss of what's happening, of those around you. Work-related mental health issues are on the rise. Burnout. How do you balance work, life, kids, friendships? All of that can cause these anxiety and depression. And now for the older adulthood, when like 65 years and plus, depression also comes in the form of loneliness, right? At this point, you're in this life phase where the people you used to play with, the people you grew up with, are no longer around you. How do you deal with that? How do you now, all right, my body is not the same. Like, I cannot do the certain things that I used to do, right? I cannot get up and go where I please as I used to. Dementia and cognitive disorders, I have to be really mindful of now, okay, watch out. Like, am I remembering these things properly? How to cope with that? Again, grief and loss of your spouses and your friends and your siblings. And I would say these are the challenges that our community is facing. And I say that this is why it is important.
Jazakumullahu khaira. I really love that explanation. There is one question I did have though. So it's definitely something that's integral in our world. We do need to know more about this. We do need to fight it more. But let's say someone is depressed. What happens if that person, a depressed person, is being told that their depression is their fault? Because oftentimes we do see this. Because you said the very sad story about your client and what happened with her. I know of other instance, I mentioned this in the last halaqah, where a girl was depressed, she was anxious, she was cutting herself. Her parent found out, and then because of that, her parent started to beat her. So, so if a depressed person hears that their depression is their fault, what happens?
You're going to send that person more in a depression state, right? I think it comes back, educating ourselves first and how to approach it. And I think that the beauty of our religion is very easy. And if you really think about the basis of our religion is kindness and empathy and understanding. Even with the people that we are the closest to is the ones we are supposed to be the most kindest to. And unfortunately, they're the ones that get the brunt of it. They're the ones that get the harshness of who we are, right? And in this, the little snippet that you told me, in that scenario, every case is different. So that's why I put in my disclosure in that point where, whatever I say is general knowledge, is general for education purposes, is that in that sense of coming back down to empathy, like saying that that person is depressed because it's their fault, that's such a judgmental statement, right? It's kind of like, all right, well, questioning why, what is making you feel this way, right? Coming back and understanding the whole entire scenario. And I think, I'm not knowledge, or I didn't go to school on the Islamic education, but I think I know enough that when the Prophet ﷺ gave his sayings, he did it with hikmah. He did it with knowledge on the entire being of that person. Because there are instances where one person he'll say, okay, you can do this, and another person he'll tell them he can do something else, but like understanding that he understood that this person was stronger than another person, right? So going back to like the different state, the nafs that you were talking about, right? Understanding that we come from all of these different nafs, right? And the stages that we are in, right? Everybody is on their journey, and everyone is unique in that. It's unique like our fingerprint. And maybe in that stage, right? Resorting to that is saying that it's your fault is coming from, I want to say, not knowing how to deal with this, right? Like, okay, in your head, in the parent's mind, the way to fix this is for you to pray, right? So it's just coming back from like, having compassion on their end as well too, right? And all right, but it comes back to educating, right? So if you can notice where you're enacting violence in that sense, right? Knowing that, just in that sense, knowing that, and assessing the situation, are you causing more harm than good with what you're saying?
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So indeed, we can surmise that blaming someone who's depressed for their depression, saying it is their fault, this will ultimately lead to worse scenarios. We're going to cause a whole cluster bubble. It's just going to be a can of worms. We're going to have a lot of problems.
There you go.
Got it. So I really like what you said about life in general, right? Work, school, marriage, love, intimacy, finance, everything we do, we will have worry, right? And one of the things that the Quran shows us is that we feeling anxious, feeling worried, feeling a depressed, natural depression is not something, it's something human. It's not something to be ashamed of. And there's no wrong in it. But society causes worry. our marriages, our work, our school, our love life, our financial aspects of our lives. All of these things will cause us worries. People who can't find a job, or people who are waiting for expecting a promotion. These are things that people get really depressed about. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Al-Quran, فَلَعَلَّكَ بَاخِعٌ نَفْسَكَ أَلَّا يَكُونُوا مُؤْمِنِينَ. That it is possible that your anguish, that your worry, that your depression will lead you to die. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here, He's telling this to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And this is not suicide. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in this situation, he is depressed, he is in anguish, he is in grief, because no one is listening to him. And this is at the early stages of Mecca, the early stages of the ba'thah or the da'wah. So he is so depressed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling him, you're going too far now. This is going to kill you. This sadness, this depression will kill you. It's not suicide. You're just going to be so sad, so depressed, you're going to keel over and die. So this is the warning that he's telling him. So in another example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, فَرَدَدْنَاهُ إِلَىٰ أُمِّهِ كَيْ تَقَرَّ عَيْنُهَا وَلَا تَحْزَنْ. Speaking about the mother of Musa alayhi salam, in which we returned Musa to his mother so that she would not worry, she would not be depressed, she would not be in anguish. And also we have the example of Ya'qub alayhi salam, where Ya'qub alayhi salam, when he heard that his son Yusuf alayhi salam had disappeared, had gone, and he knew that Yusuf's brothers were lying, and we all know the story, he was in grief, and he's so sad. وَأَبْيَضَتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ. That his eyes became white in blindness because of his grief, because of his depression. So there's nothing having natural depression, there is nothing wrong with it. Would you agree? There's nothing wrong with having natural depression. It's a part of life. But this is something a point that can help as a coping mechanism. People often feel that it's their fault that they are depressed. Or maybe they feel worse about themselves because of the depression. And they start to manifest something else, right? So this is the first point. The second point, in terms of understanding depression from the Quran and how to cope with it, or how, inshallah, to cope with it, would be, and I say that because I'm not the mental health expert here, you are, right? But when Abu Bakr As-Siddiq was scared, and he was in the Gharu Thawr, he was scared, he was anxious, he was shaking, he was nervous, he was depressed, right? There are two men trapped in a tiny cave. The Quraysh have their swords, they're looking for them. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said the famous words, "La tahzan inna Allaha ma'ana." Do not worry, do not be depressed, do not be in anguish. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with us. So knowing that we have a loving God, knowing that we have a loving Lord who wants us to succeed, that is a coping mechanism by itself. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always with you. The third point, is sometimes we forget that pain and suffering are a part of life. Pain and suffering is a part of life. There is no life that is perfect. There is no life that is stress-free. And when a child is born, the first thing they do is cry, right? So this life is not a life of comfort. This life is not a life that is stress-free. If anyone says that they know so-and-so and they think that their life is stress-free, and that's one of the dangers of social media, that we see pictures on Instagram, we see pictures on Facebook, we think that people's lives are stress-free. But to know that life is not stress-free, that pain and suffering is a part of life, that is another coping mechanism as well that the Quran gives us. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that if a wound has afflicted us, that it has also afflicted people before you. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Muslims after the Battle of Uhud about this. وَتِلْكَ أَيَّامٍ نُدَاوِرُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. That these are the days that we have distributed amongst you. And some are good and some are bad. Many times we want all the good days. Or sometimes it seems like all we have are bad days. So what do you think about this? That pain and suffering are a part of life. That it is imperative to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with us. That it is okay to be in anxiousness and anxiety. It is okay to have that natural depression. What do you make of this?
So I'd like to kind of give like a medical terminology of what anxiety and depression is, right? So anxiety has to do where you have excessive worry, fear, nervousness about future events, right? And it can manifest in itself in your heart racing, sweating, like sweaty palms. And another thing that I've also seen that's very common is that it may not manifest in itself in your body, but it manifests up here. Racing thoughts, like you're just continuously thinking about a certain topic that's coming up, you're continuously overthinking what to cook for dinner, or presentations that you have to give, or maybe something happened between you and a family member and you just, consciously just keep thinking about certain things. And that's when you understand that anxiety falls on a different cluster. And we use anxiety and depression interchangeably, but they're different, okay? So now depression is a mood disorder, right? And that has to do with persistent feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and a loss of interest in the activities that you once do. So it's okay to feel sad. It's okay that, something has hurt you or something bad has happened, right? But when I'm sitting with clients to really give a diagnosis of depression, that's like, okay, you have to have these persistent feelings over 6 months, for meaning that you're not able to go out of bed, you're not able to live the fulfilled life that you are able to do due to these hopelessness feelings, right? Or you're not motivated enough to do certain things, right? Sometimes sitting down with clients and working with them and combating those things. So what you were saying about believing in I like to say spiritual because I do work with, populations that are not Muslims as well, and Muslims, and just believing in a higher spiritual self, like, okay, that everything that has happened to me has come from God, and God has always, always had my back. I went through, I had a client, she was a Christian, from a Christian faith. This girl's only 22 years old, okay? Her parents went through, was kicked out of their homes. She lived in the car for several, days. Moved out of her mom's house at 17, worked hard to build herself up to afford her own apartment. Became a phlebotomist. She coped with different ways, but she got into an abusive relationship. Got into a car accident that left her debilitating and not able to walk. She came out of it only to have her friends supported her to be able to motivate her to walk again, only to have that same friend being shot and murdered. Come back and sit down to therapy, right? Keep finding herself in these abusive relationships. Then when she's like, all right, I really need to get my life together, I really need to do certain things, now got pregnant. Now having a baby that's coming, this girl's only 22 years old, now deciding if I needed to keep or not have this baby. These are the struggles that people are going through. And sitting down there and alhamdulillah, she went through and she had the baby. But at the end of it all, everything that this person said was, God always had my back. I came out stronger than ever before. Sometimes you're sitting there with those hard emotions when you are having a baby and not knowing how to financially survive with being able to take care of a child on your own. Sitting with those hard emotions, right? But for her to come through all of that, all the hardship, and with my Muslim clients, I really love honing in our religion that has so much solace. Allah has promised, after every hardship comes ease. And being able to hear that from someone who is not Muslim, seeing that Allah, there's God that always has my back, right? It's a solace that we are given.
MashaAllah.
I hope that answers it.
Yeah, it does answer it, alhamdulillah. I'm really glad you said that. Indeed, having a spiritual inclination will help with coping with depression, coping with anxiety, grief, anguish, you name it. Having a spiritual inclination, and the best type of spiritual inclination is what? Is whose? is ours, right?
Hours, yeah.
Okay then. So it's our spiritual inclination, our iman, our tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we put our trust in Him, but at the end of the day, we try to take our steps to get to those goals of the Shariah, to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and inshallah, all of this suffering will end. So in terms of, so definitely from the spiritual aspect, the Quran has many more points on how to help cope with the depression. Like I said, spirituality can help be a cure to many aspects, but what happens when a person needs counseling? What happens when two couples need mediation and both people in the couple are depressed? What happens when someone needs someone to speak to? An imam, a scholar, a sheikh will not be able to do so. They could probably direct them to other people such as you, but they would not innately know what to do. However, the Quran does provide more points and guidelines on this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, and it's the same verse I just quoted, وَتِلْكَ أَيَّامٍ نُدَاوِرُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ, that these are the days that we distribute among people. Some are good and some are bad. And this is the fact of life, that some days are good and some days are bad. So no one will ever live a stress-free life. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also tells us that أَوَلَا يَرَوْنَ أَنَّهُمْ يُفْطَرُونَ فِي كُلِّ عَامٍ, that مَرَّةً أَوْ مَرَّتَيْن, that don't they see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, don't they see a big calamity come into their lives and either one time or two times every single year? So calamities, problems are a part of life. So these calamities obviously can lead to depression, can lead to people having anxiety, to lead to people going over the threshold of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed, such as suicide. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the people this, that let them think about that. You're going through something, but people have also gone through it. And this is the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The next point, and it's just a few more points about how we can utilize the Quran to help cope with the depression, is through the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I know it's such a normal thing now, right? Everyone is speaking about mercy. Ramadan is coming up. Oh, okay, the month of mercy. Okay, turns to Allah. Allah is merciful. But it's a lot more deeper than that, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ, do not kill yourselves. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ. And then right after that, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُمْ رَحِيمًا, do not kill yourselves because Allah is always with you, not just merciful on you, but He's with you, Rahiman. He's with you as a mercy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with you as a mercy. But this is the wisdom of the Quran. There's always a bait and switch. There's always, I don't want to use the word trap, but it's like a linguistic trap, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُمْ رَحِيمًا لَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِكُمْ رَحِيمًا. Don't kill yourselves. Don't even think about suicide. Allah is with you and Allah will always be with you. He is a mercy to you. But then what does He say? Right? There's a threat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also comes with a threat that whoever has done so and transgresses upon that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden, then indeed he will face the torment. Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not want people to commit suicide. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants people to value their lives. But why is this so important? Because the lives that we have are not our lives. They are the lives that belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we take away that life, what are we doing? In a way, we're spitting in Allah's face. Astaghfirullah. Right? These lives are Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's lives. So we need to cherish these lives. And that means seeking help when we face these type of mental health issues. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَرَحْمَتِي وَسِعَتْ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ, my mercy encompasses everything. And قُلْ يَا عِبَادِي الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ, do not despair in the mercy of Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always be with you, Rahiman. Just two more points. So this is something I actually did want your opinion on. Well, I want your opinion on everything, really. You're just absolutely brilliant. But I really wanted your opinion on this. Belief in qadr, predestination. One of the wisdoms of the Quran is that it really speaks to us in terms of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala predetermines things, right? So whenever we believe in qadr, the world does become more clear because we have a proper structured worldview of what life is supposed to be. How are we supposed to live it? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that لِكَيْ لَا تَحْزَنْ وَعَلَى تحزنوا على ما فاتكم لكي لا تحزنوا على ما فاتكم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He does not want us to be worried about what you didn't get. That you must be content with what you have. And He would say to His nephew Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, no, my dear nephew, no. You did not get something and it was not meant for you. And whatever was meant for you will never lose its place from you. لا يضروك بشيء قد كتب الله عليك رفعت الأقلام وجفت الصحف. That and the pens have been raised and the ink has dried from the pages. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also tells the hypocrites in the Quran, the hypocrites in the Battle of Uhud, who stayed in their homes when the Muslims were fighting. And they pretended to be Muslims and they took the Shahada. But at the end of the day, they were hypocrites, they stayed in their homes. And when they saw that the Muslims had kind of lost the Battle of Uhud, and they found out that many Muslims lost their lives, what happened was they started to mock them. If they only stayed in their homes, they would not have died. If they only stayed in their homes, this would have happened or that would have happened. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to them by saying that if they stayed at home and their debts were written for them, then their bodies would voluntarily leave their homes to be killed in the battlefield. So we cannot change the predestination, the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This was pre-decreed, it was predetermined, and everything is the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, for anyone who has a phone or books, I want you to write this down. Write down this quote. We use qadr, predestination, to console ourselves. We use qadr, predestination, to console ourselves about the past, but not to justify the future. We use qadr to console ourselves about the past, but never to justify the future. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said in a hadith that Adam alayhi salam and Musa alayhi salam met in the afterworld. And Musa alayhi salam, in typical Musa fashion, he started to scream and yell at Adam alayhi salam. Why, O father, because Adam is our father, why did you eat from the tree? Why did you disobey Allah? And now we're all here in this earth instead of being in paradise. Now you were expelled from Jannah, so now we're all here on this world. Why did you do that? And Adam replied to Musa and said, Oh my son Musa, don't you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had written 50,000 years that we would be sent to earth before I was even created? That we would live on this earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had predetermined it, had predestined it, had pre-decreed it. So nothing can change the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how can you criticize me for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has predetermined? So Adam did not justify his sin by qadr, but he justified the calamity of leaving Jannah to come down to earth. He justified that, saying that this was predestined and that this is the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We cannot change it. What do you think?
I have 2 points. So one of the things that I would like to touch on, and going back to what you were saying about having the mercy of Allah, that I think you mentioned the word, like the linguistic trap, right? And in that moment, when we are in this depressive state, and sometimes the depressive state or anxiousness may come from the things that we have done wrong, right? Like we have done certain things, or we act or behaved a certain way. And sometimes sitting with Muslim clients, it's like, how can I sit and pray? How can I come back into the masjid? Or I feel so ashamed, right, of like turning to Allah, right, at this point. And that's where I like to like catch the thought, right? And it's like, that's when we think about the waswasa of shaitan, right? We think about, go and do this little sin, go and do this little step. And that's what we're taught about what the waswasa of shaitan may look like, right? But the waswasa of shaitan, that in itself is telling you to feel guilty, to go to Allah. That's in itself is like a waswasa of shaitan, because what was the promise that Shaitan made to Allah? Who knows? Huh? Right? He was like, his biggest thing was, I'm going to make them turn away from you. Right? And so in those moments of despair, and if there's moments in those anguish, talk to Allah like He's your best friend at this point, right? Like, go to Allah. He wants us to turn to Him. And even in those things, when you're coming back to the point of like the qadr of Allah, our mistakes, are the things that we happen, they are a part of this life. And no one's gonna take a magic wand and make all of the bad emotions just disappear, right? They're just as important as happiness, excitement, and joy, and camaraderie, like what we feel. But arguments, having on the flip side, those negative parts, it's just that we just don't know how to deal with them, right? They're just so heavy. And it's a matter of learning how to cope, right? Or a matter of like picking yourself back up, right? And not just staying down. So finding out what works for you in that point. So sometimes I like to go this quote: if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, then everything you see will be a nail, right? So let's say you talked about, having the Quranic parts as in your toolbox. Yes, there is times where I'm going to need to turn to Allah, or I'm going to need to listen to the Quran. Or actually, once you understand like you believe in wudu, like once you have that belief of how much wudu can like take you out of your anger, that can be something that you can, tackle into. And salah in itself, just like I'm feeling so despair, but having that khushu in that salah, so not just waiting for the 5 daily prayers, but hey, I'm feeling so thing right now, I just need to make 2 rakat at this point. Like even in that can be in itself as a coping mechanism. But sometimes I just want to go for a walk, or I just need to read a book, or I just need to detach, watch some television, or something like that. But just understand, or play with the kids or grandkids, or being out at that point, like finding and assessing, what do I need right now, right? So that's kind of, I hope I answered it.
No, Jazakumullahu khaira. I really appreciate that. I really loved what you said about the quote about having a hammer, everything will seem like a nail. I think that's very true. Also, what you said about shaitan and his waswasa of shaitan, because my next very point was إِنَّمَا النَّجْوَى مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ لِيَحْزِنَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. That shaitan wants to use depression as a tactic. That shaitan wants you to be anxious, he wants you to be sad, he wants you to be grief-ridden. Because what happens is, if you're depressed, what happens is, people around you, they're not going to be the same, right? They're going to treat you different, or they might look at you a different way. And that what happens is, that leads to other effects. That, in a way, it destroys the family. It destroys marriages. A partner is depressed, or a wife or a husband are depressed, the other partner doesn't know about that. So shaitan wants this to happen. It's a tactic. Depression can sometimes, not all the time, but it can absolutely sometimes be a tactic. So knowing that shaitan, knowing that Iblis is that vile enemy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing that Iblis is the enemy to the prophets, to the prophet, knowing that Iblis is our enemy, he is an enemy to mankind, so we take him as an enemy as Allah commanded us. This can also be a coping mechanism to know that this could be from shaitan. This could be from shaitan. So, and my last point in terms of how we can use the Quran to help cope with it, before I turn it over to you, just one more time, is that it's okay to feel anxious. It's okay to feel grief. It's okay to be naturally depressed. And if you're depressed, you need to seek help for it. But while you're seeking help for it, while you're seeking support for whatever you're going through, and you absolutely must and should, you should try to, and I remind myself first and foremost, we should try to channel that grief and anxiety into, and I know this is the most imam thing to say, but ibadah, dua, dhikr, salah, because yes, these are not all the cures, but it can lead to the cures. And no doubt salah will help in your depression. No doubt not missing your salah would help in your depression. No doubt making dua, and in dua, what can we do? We can cry, we can beg, we can plead, oh Allah, help me with this. Oh Allah, help me with that. Oh Allah, What did Ayub say, alayhi salam? Inni masani durra wa anta arhamur rahimin. Even when his whole life was in shambles, that's when he made that famous dua. Affliction has reached me, and oh Allah, you are the most merciful of those who are merciful. So whenever, and also Aisha, our mother, radiallahu anha, said that whenever the Prophet was depressed, whenever he was stressed out, whenever he couldn't bear it anymore, he would almost run to stand up in prayer. Because indeed prayer, indeed dua, indeed ibadah definitely opens up a channel to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So while it's not the only cure, and it can never be the only cure, it definitely helps to get to the cure. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, because that same student that I mentioned before about like her cutting, and one of the things that, you know, she said to me that was so profound, and it just had me, right, was like, you know, she'll talk to people and they're like, she cried and she was like, yeah, go make wudu. Like the wudu and the water's just gonna wash away the way how I feel, right? So it's like, yes, in her end, she didn't get to the root cause, right? What is causing you to feel this way, right? And, you know, when at this point, like, sometimes understanding that that may not be the best solution for somebody at that time, but it doesn't mean that it's not a good solution, right? But sometimes understanding what that person needs in that moment, or come forward, like, what is it that you need in that moment? And that takes skills, and that is what, you know, therapy and counseling does, is to teach you the skills. And yeah, I'm gonna stop.
Okay, no problem. Jazakumullahu khairan. We have 10 minutes.
Okay.
So in these 10 minutes, what we're going to do is this. You're going to imagine that everyone here is depressed. What you're going to do is you're going to diagnose it in only a few minutes. What would you do?
Okay. So again, so we got disclaimers that, you know, everything is confidential, as we say here, and we're not going to say anything else. And, you know, I like to sit down and say that, first of all, you are the professional in your life. I'm just here as a guide. You're in the I'm in the passenger seat. You're in the driver's seat, right? One of the things that I like to do, especially when it comes to depressive symptoms, is this therapeutic approach called CBT, right? So CBT, C stands for cognitive, which is the way we think. Behavioral is the way we act, and just like the therapeutic, you know, things that we do. So the basis of it is, you know, how does our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors influence one another? The way we talk to ourselves influence the way we feel, and the way we feel, you know, has an effect on how we behave on certain things, right? So for example, let's say you're in a situation where you receive critical feedback at the work, at the masjid, at school, at some place that you receive this negative feedback upon the hard work that you put in. Your thought is, I am not good enough, right? I'm terrible at this, I'm gonna stop, I can't do this anymore. What is the emotion that you're gonna feel now? Like if you were in that position, what is the emotions that you would feel? Sad, upset?
Brothers, none of you are depressed?
Not depressed, but if someone gave you a hard right, or your wife comes and say, you're not good enough, you never did this, or something like that, what is it that you're gonna start feeling inside? Right? Or like something like you feel kind of a certain way, so then now the next time comes around, you're anxious about this. What if I mess this up again, right? And then what happened with the behavior? What is more likely you're gonna do now? Stop doing it. You're going to avoid the situation. I'm never going back there again. I'm going to avoid it. I'm going to procrastinate. I'm not going to get better at that skill, right? So then now, how do you think depression happens? It's a cycle, right? It's a cycle that keeps happening in different areas in your life where you have these what we call cognitive distortions, right? The way we think, and there's several. And I'm gonna run through them quickly right now. Like 5 of them is called all or nothing thinking, like viewing situation in black and white. Like, I failed this test, so I'm a failure. Challenging that thought, it's like, maybe I didn't do well on this test, but I can study differently next time. Surprisingly, these are very general terms that I'm saying, but it's more complex, right? but it's just an overarching thing that things that how we talk to ourselves is so much important. More important now how we talk to other people, right? How we speak to ourselves. Viewing a negative, so overgeneralization, viewing a negative event as a never-ending pattern. Well, I always mess things up. But looking at different instances encounter with success, like you're having this dialogue in your head, like you're countering what is it that you're, telling yourself. You're challenging it, meaning reality facting it, like have facts that comes up to challenge the thoughts that you have. Expecting the worst possible outcome. If I make a mistake at work, I'll get fired. Like putting one thing to another where it has no correlation, where evaluating the realistic probability of you messing up and what the potential solutions are. Mental filtering, focusing only on the negative details and discrediting the positive, or also only looking at the positive and discrediting the negative. Personalization, I think this one is a big one for all of us, is that blaming oneself for the events outside of one's control. So that coming of, my friend is upset, or somebody's upset, that means they're upset at me, or I did something. Or if somebody came and told you how they felt about something that happened, oh, that's a personal attack on how I behaved, right? So then now a person will come in and feel defensive. So some of the things that, underlying all of this is skills, right? We need communication skills, how to communicate yourself assertively. So those are some of the things that I would do in it, and that's why I've said that, therapy in itself is like a fingerprint. It's unique to each one of us, because yes, anxiety, sadness is general, but how it looks like for each one of us is very different.
So I think there's a few key words we can take away from both of these sessions of this halaqah. One would be the spiritual inclination. How the Quran and Sunnah, how did the Prophets do it? How did the Sahaba and the Sahabiyat do it? The other one would be, where you would come in, the professional help, therapy, counseling, mediation. And then the third would be social help, in terms of what are the family members doing, what are the friends doing, what are the imams doing, what are the sheikhs doing, what are the masajid doing, what are the communities doing, in order to either make people aware of it or help people who actually really need it. So if someone is suffering from depression in this community, or in any community, any masajid around this area, what can they do? How important really is therapy? Because I think what everyone will take away and should take away is that if you're depressed, if you're anxious, if it is distorting your life, you need therapy, you need counseling. That's where you would come in. So that would be the last point.
So definitely, having that decision of saying that, okay, I need help, is one of the biggest strengths that we can owe it to ourselves. Because realizing that something needs to change within ourselves it's a big thing, more than we give credit to, right? Like saying, look in the mirror that I messed up. Like I may have caused something to someone else, or I have caused something to someone else, or myself. That's like a big, transition in our mindset, right? So once you're at that phase, it's like, okay, now how do I go out and help? Because I think that's the biggest thing. And how masjids can and imams be a big, incorporation is that it's actually doing what we're doing right now. Bringing awareness, collaborating with a lot more Muslim mental health professionals out there, and like incorporate these topics in our Friday khutbahs, and realizing that community is a big part of our religion, right? So organizing workshops with mental health professionals, and some of the topics that, challenging, like real life situation, like how to deal with stress management, parenting challenges, mental health in a youth crisis, such as like grief, addiction, parenting challenges, having like networking events, like people who are struggling in finding a job, how to fix your resumes, having academic stress, like things that are, happening, and looking at the issues that the community is actually facing. Establishing a network, like a connection with Muslim mental health professionals. So if you are struggling and you feel like you do need help in that end, connecting with the directory of Muslim mental health can help. And I think that's the basis.
Okay, jazakumullahu khaira. So if someone is depressed or is going through anything, how would they reach you? Where exactly do you work, and how would they reach you?
So a lot of things you can do is go on Psychology Today. You can, filter it out and find different Muslim mental health, professionals out there. So I'm out there, so I have that. But I also work with a company called the New Hope Counseling Center, and they have another 2 Muslim counselors that are working there as well. But if you find me on Psychology Today profile and you do want to have therapy, I also am connected with a lot of Muslim mental health professionals where, I could connect you to the resources that you may need.
Jazakumullah khaira for your insight, for your expertise, and for your collaboration. Would a mental health workshop be something you'd be interested in doing?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll speak to the boss. All right, inshallah. I think that concludes it. Seek help. Seek help from Allah, first and foremost. Seek help from the Quran. And those things, inshallah, will lead you to seek help from people who can actually help you with whatever clinical things you're going through. Depression, anxiety, grief, loss of a family member, sexual abuse, child abuse, all types of abuse that can lead to depression, or depression can lead to those things. Seek help. And if you know someone who needs help, don't be arrogant about it or ignorant about it, but help others who need the help. And if you don't know, and if you cannot help someone, then you reach out now if you might need to. That's why we have people like Sister Saudia here. That's why we have other people in our community who have been trained to do this. Imams were not trained to do this. Sheikhs were not trained to do this. But people like Sister Saudia were trained to do this. And inshallah,
we need your help too, because we do have a lot. I think one of the biggest topics our Muslim mental health professionals have in the chat, it's like collaborating with imams, because we have this side, right? But then sometimes we don't have the Shariah or the fiqh knowledge to handle certain situations that are happening. So, having a collaborative working relationship, that really is beneficial on both ends.
Jameel, mashallah. Inshallah, I will always be there. And inshallah, this is something that we want to keep doing more of, fixing our mental health, making sure that we're on top of things when it comes to living a comfortable and safe and a life that's filled with tranquility and peace. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, these are the days I have distributed amongst you. Some are good and some are bad. Jazakumullahu khairah for all of those who have attended or have shared or have supported this halaqah. Inshallah, there will be many more to come. But as for this first halaqah on depression, this is now at a close. We might be having a one-off halaqah in Ramadan, run by me, inshallah. But that is TBD. Once again, thank you again, Sister Sadia, and Jazakumullahu khairah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.